So I'd like to call the first meeting of the Fort River School Building Committee to order at 4:04. And I'd like to welcome everyone to being here, and thank you for your volunteer service. It's really significant. I thought about this last night, just thinking about it this morning as well. Just that we're fortunate. I feel like we're so fortunate. I'm fortunate to work in Amherst, where so many people from different stakeholders are willing to come and volunteer on really important committees like this. So I just want to start the meeting by thanking everyone. So I'm Mike Morrison, the superintendent of schools, and I'd like to just explain a little my role, and then we can do introductions and get to the agenda. So I'm an ex officio, or non-voting member of this committee, and so much like the school committee when I talked to Mr. Nakajima, often it's my role when the school committee is reorganizing to just set the meeting and then pass the chairship over to whoever is elected by the rest of the committee. I wouldn't vote on that much like in school committee meetings because I'm not a member. And so we thought, given that this is a new committee and that there isn't a kind of defined chair, that I would just do this introductory role very similar to the reorganization meetings. My role will be as needed as the course of the committee when it's helpful for me to be here. People can request that. And I really want to, again, thank everybody for coming and agreeing to be on it. So if you could just do quick introductions, your name and perhaps your connection to, like whether you're a staff member or a parent or a community member, that'd be great. Why don't we go this way? Let people sit up.
My name is Christine Royal. I'm an architect. I work as a capital project manager for Amherst College. My son is a student at Wildwood, and I am a community member of this group.
I left out one thing, sorry to break the flow, Nicole. So this meeting is being taped by Amherst Media. I apologize for not saying that. There was an error on the agenda. It's not broadcast live. We're not in a location where that is possible, but it is being taped for later broadcast by Amherst Media. I apologize for the omission. Sorry, Nicole.
I'm Nicole Singer. I'm the art teacher at Fort River. Yeah, that's all.
Hi there, Diane Chamberlain, interim principal at Fort River. Maria Kubicki, I'm a Crocker Farm parent. I've also lived in Amherst since 1999.
I'm Irene Hoble. I'm a Wildwood parent, and I've been here for 80 years.
I'm Eric Nakajima. I'm on the Amherst School Committee and the representative from the committee. I've been in town off and on since 1974. And in fact, I'm a graduate of Fort River Elementary School, and I totally forgot this. I actually have at home a little certificate, whatever it's called, like a little graduation or advancement ceremony. I actually have one from Fort River that I should have brought with me. Because I think you mentioned something like, oh, you got to bring it to the first meeting. So I'm excited to be here, but also just to say that for the school committee, since I'm here representing the school committee, the committee is really excited about the work of this group. We're very happy everyone's willing and in fact enthusiastic, and in fact some even, whether it's the right term or not, sort of competed to get on here and had the great honor of being chosen out of, I think, the proverbial hat amongst the other folks who signed up. And so we're excited to do this, and we're excited to make a lot of progress together and looking forward to it. Thanks.
I'm Jean Fay. I'm a special education paraeducator at Crocker Farm Elementary. It's my 20th year. I'm also the president of the Amherst Pelham Education Association. I represent all of the teachers, the paraeducators, and the clericals that work for the Amherst Pelham Regional School District. I have 3 children that went through the Amherst Public School System. I've lived in the area since the mid-70s, so I've been around for a while. My husband is born and raised Amherst. He's actually Pelham, but his family is also born and raised, so longtime residents of the area.
I'm Claire McGinnis. I am on school town staff in the finance department, and I don't have anything else to say about that.
I'm Jonathan Salvin. I'm a parent of 2 kids at Fort River School. I'm also an architect by profession. I work at Cunard Architects here in town.
Anthony Delaney, procurement officer for the town of Amherst. I just started in that job in September, so new to the town. And I'll be an ex officio member here too, just here to help the procurement process.
I'm Heather Sheldon. I've got a daughter at Fort River currently. I'm currently non-practicing architect, so because I haven't done that since my kids were born, but was registered in the past. I am here representing the Special Education Parent Advisory Council and hope to be a link between them and here.
My name is Allison Page, and I have 2 children in the district, one at Fort River and one at the high school. And my profession is project managing of building projects. And right now I'm working with Smith College on their library renovation project. I'm the project manager for the libraries on that.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for everyone for being here. So the next item on the agenda is public comment. And since the only member of our public happens to be behind the camera, I still want to give her the opportunity if you'd like to make one. She's shaking her head no, just for the sake of the viewing audience. So the next is to, actually before we get to electing chair, I'm sorry, there's one other piece. I didn't know if there was someone who's willing, I have to leave slightly early today. I just changed my schedule and I changed from not being here at the beginning to not being here later because I thought that was more important. Who is willing to take notes until we have some routine set up?
Happy to.
Thank you. Otherwise, I would do it. I'd be happy to do it, but since I won't be here, I'm transitioning notes halfway through. Thank you, Diane.
Sure.
So then, the next order of business is to elect a chair. So, responsibilities of the chair, and certainly if you'd like to speak to your role as a chair of a different committee, but would be really to help in setting the agenda, to hear from all members. A lot of it's focused on communication. It is an incredibly important job. And it is, to be very fair, it's a job that takes a fair amount of time and energy to kind of shepherd a committee through a process such as the one that this committee is about to enter. I don't want to scare people, but I also want to be realistic, and I don't want people to jump into it if they don't feel like they have the time that they're able to spend on it. Is there anything you want to add?
No, I mean I've done this. I've done it for the regional committee for over a year now, so I think. I'd say a couple of things. One, obviously, meeting facilitation skills are important, which mostly means making sure everyone gets a chance to speak fairly and completely. 2, I think there is some work involved in setting up the agendas and doing sort of the advance and prep work for meetings, but I usually find that depending on who we're working with, either you and the school staff or with the town staff are usually very good at helping to pull together a lot of the actual work, but it's a good duty in terms of trying to make sure that issues that are being raised, that the agenda is complete and things like that. So
Are there any, before we get to the voting procedure, are there any clarifying questions that people might have around that? See none. So the process I was thinking about was that anyone here could nominate anyone else, including themselves, to be the chair. We take all the nominations, and then we could have a vote for chair. That's agreeable to the group. See no disagreeable faces. Are there any nominations for chair?
I'd like to nominate Diane Chamberlain. She's got capacity for that.
So while you're thinking about whether you would accept that nomination, which you are not down to do, I'm not discouraging you, but I just, like, if you don't want to do it, or if anyone doesn't want to do it, they don't have to do it. Are there other nominations to give Ms. Chamberlain a little think time?
I don't know, I haven't even said anything to you about this, Jean, but just given the fact that you've done a lot of organizing, I wonder if you would mind my nominating you.
Thank you, but I respectfully.
If there's anybody else game, I'm happy to respectfully decline too. I got a lot on my plate. Anyone really?
So here's what I'd say, if I could still in this role for a minute, is I think, my personal opinion, I'm not a voter on this, I think you have a lot of leadership. And if it's something that you feel like you can do and are willing to do, great. And if it's something that you don't feel like you are willing or have the capacity to do, I don't mean literal capacity, I mean time capacity, I think that's acceptable as well. Because I feel, and maybe I'm misreading you, that you're...
I'm concerned about a time commitment, that's for sure. I spend a lot of time at work.
And be an interim chair, and this is the first meeting, an interim chair until for a month. months or 2 months and then revisit.
There's nothing precluding that.
I mean, if you want, we could even make that, there's nothing precluding it, but it's like one of those classic things where it's like the current tax cuts. They say they're going to expire, they might not expire, I can't just renew them or whatever. We could actually make it explicit if you want, and revisit in months. Or not.
No pressure. I would feel more comfortable if there was a potential to bow out if that was the case, yes. Because I am concerned about doing the job well. I think it would need to be done well and
Well, and once we've been meeting for a while, I think it might be more clear, you know, who would be an appropriate person
Right.
too.
I know it's kind of hard to go in one.
Yeah, like, yeah, we've never met
That's what-
most of us.
That was my purpose to say.
Yeah, that's what I
chair.
thought, yeah.
We'll mean someone else has to take notes today.
This was my job. I nominated you, I will take notes.
I'm happy to steal your computer and take a bunch of notes. Yeah.
Well, we haven't voted yet. I just
Okay.
want to, you know, I don't know if I was encouraging someone else to perhaps make another nomination, but it doesn't seem like it's been.
I'm inclined to like nominate myself and volunteer. I have never done this kind of thing before. You know, this could also be an interim thing of like see how Nicole does and then revisit and if she's blowing it, we change the people, you know. That sort of thing could work. I feel like I just did something crazy. Help me.
Jump in, Nicole.
Okay.
So we have 2 nominations. It seems like there's a consensus on the committee that it would be somewhat short-term and to be revisited. I like that suggestion. I'm intentionally giving a lot of wait time, just as people think about it. Not that more nominations may necessarily come up. It wasn't a push for you or anyone else, but it's a teaching strategy that's failing at the moment. So I want to go back to, I suppose you'd accept your own nomination, Nicole, so I'm not going to necessarily check
Yeah,
that.
I guess that's how that works.
Diane, given that there's another nomination, would you like to accept the prior one, or would you like to?
I would love to defer to Nicole to give it a try.
So we have one
Thank you,
nomination. So all those in favor of Nicole becoming an interim chair of the building committee, can you say aye?
Okay.
Since I didn't have to raise hands, I apologize. Are there any abstentions? Or anyone who disagrees?
Thank you.
So I'll leave it to Nicole. Can I say one more thing before?
Hey, go for it.
So I think because Nicole is now chair and yet didn't create the agenda for today's meeting, I think any support that, being transparent, Mr. Nakajima and I worked together. We did meet with Mr. Delaney around the procurement aspect. So any support that might be helpful, particularly for today's meeting, since you're now chairing a meeting that you weren't necessarily connected to. Yeah.
Do you mind, why don't we go through the agenda at the beginning and talk about, just very, very briefly and concisely, why it was set up the way it was, and then people can also then disagree. I want to do something else if they want, but also be more explicable, I think, in that case. Thank you. Other than the obvious 3 elements, which are the first ones, which are obvious, we thought that it was important to review the charge of the committee flowing from both the town meeting vote, obviously, but also whatever framing decisions are made by the school committee, and get clarity around those as they're needed. And then because getting assistance to do some of the analysis of the site or building conditions or other work, project work, is a key next step. We thought it was also critical to review how the town engages in procurement, what that process looks like. So what are the mechanics of it? The thought, at least, and again, people can disagree if they want, but the thought behind, at least from Mike and my perspective, was that regardless of the content of the scope or what you're procuring, understanding how the town actually does these things and is going to require us to do these things is an important step in cumulative knowledge building, so that then when we're talking about what we want to do, we can at least input that into the steps that are already required by the town, essentially, in order to access the funds and contract services. And then these meetings are being very happily and voluntarily taped, which also means we then have to pay Amherst Media for the privilege of training people to tape this, which is great. And then the committee planning element, which seems like it's sort of thrown on there, isn't really intended to be thrown on there because that could be potentially the longest element of the agenda, depending on how quickly we get through the first elements, because it's literally laying out then what does this committee want to do. One of the things, speaking for you, one of the things that Mike was really hot to trot to emphasize in this process was the fact that there isn't any external body. I mean, there are other laws and other governing entities, but there's no other, this is it. This is the group that's going to be making the decisions around how we're doing the work we're doing. And so this is precisely not overly framed in terms of coming in with a set of here's what we're doing and here's how we're doing it. Because at least from his and my perspective, it was important to level set the group that this is the group that's going to be doing the work, making the decisions and framing things out. So on behalf of the school committee, I apologize this hasn't gotten faster. In terms of what's on the agenda, I'm just saying there's actually an art to it because the intention was to make sure the committee sits first in what you're choosing to do. Did I get that right?
Absolutely.
Cool.
Precisely.
Now I'm done.
Cool. Thank you. So at this point, I feel like I have a bunch of handouts that go with various bullet points here, but since I didn't create the handouts, I'm going to ask for some support in this department. So at this point, we're reviewing the charge of the committee. I'm assuming there's one of these pages is about that. There we go, mission statement. Mission statement for the Fort River School Building Committee.
So
Go ahead, please.
So I think the three handouts that perhaps relate most to this agenda item, one is exactly what you said, the mission statement. The second is a page from the town meeting warrant from the spring. So it's, you know, we're looking at Article 15, it starts at Article 13. And the last is the colorful piece of paper that talks about a feasibility process that was also presented with the joint capital plan meeting and at town meeting. Those three things may be of use in this.
Cool. At this point, I would like to read these things for myself. Do we all want to take a couple minutes to read these things and then discuss them from there? Yeah, cool.
Are you the camera?
Oh, right, we have to do that. Camera. Okay. Can we start like at one end of here and then just do a go around? People feel comfortable reading that? Yes? Cool. Would you start us, please?
Sure. The mission statement for the Fort River School Building Committee. The Fort River School Building Committee is charged by the Amherst School Committee to oversee the Fort River site and building feasibility study as authorized by Amherst Town Meeting in March of 2017. The mission of the School Building Committee is to ensure a feasibility study process that will produce educationally sound, environmentally sustainable, and fiscally responsible options for the Fort River Elementary School site. Additionally, the School Building Committee is charged with proactively engaging the community throughout the study for the purpose of informing and soliciting input. The committee has final authority on all project decisions and will make recommendations to the school committee on all financial, contractual, and scheduling matters.
Thank you. By the way, as we read, go ahead and like write down questions and stuff in the margins, and we'll all sort of pull them later. Go ahead.
Sure. The school building committee will limit their consideration of options to a K through 6 elementary school on the Fort River Elementary School site and will sunset upon completion of its deliverables and presentation of its results.
Thanks.
This feasibility study will include a full site, structural, and environmental analysis and will be led by an architect, owner's project manager, and a team of building and environmental experts.
Thank you. This next paragraph is in Norma. If you would like to pass the torch midway through, that's fine.
Specifically, the school building committee will be tasked with hiring an owner project manager who will oversee technical aspects of the project and make related recommendations to the school building committee, establishing a community liaison and communications plan to actively and regularly inform the community and town officials about the project's progress, and solicit input. Hiring an architect who has strong experience with school projects and is committed to green and net zero buildings. Hiring other consultants to work in concert with the architect, including landscape designers, structural engineers, school safety experts, civil engineers, green design/energy consultants, environmental consultants, and geotechnical engineers. Oversee the above-named team's site and building analysis to ensure thorough and robust exploration of all possible site options that meet the community's goals. Soliciting input from educational planners and district educators around educational programming. Soliciting initial schematic drawings of multiple options for site and building. Contracting an independent cost estimator to evaluate costs of each possible option presented by the architect. And presenting a final report to the Amherst School Committee and town meeting that encompass work done to date and viable site options.
Thanks. Oh, we have a lot of awesome stuff ahead of us. Okay. Also, let's pause there for a moment. What are people noticing, wondering, need more clarification about with this?
Forgive me if I'm wrong, but at a school committee meeting, did you guys talk about adding pre-K to this?
Yes,
So,
I thought we even voted to include.
I thought so.
Maybe a version control that showed around what was being distributed to them. I mean, or maybe not. I mean, it should have had pre in there. I think we voted.
Yeah,
You think we didn't?
I'm not confident to venture a guess. We didn't- yeah, and I remember the conversation, I don't remember where.
I'm confident to venture a guess that we did that.
Okay. Yeah.
So is there a way to check on that somehow? And
Absolutely, not this, right this
Oh,
second.
sure, yeah,
But
but,
absolutely, and I'll help make a note of doing that.
awesome, thank you. Other
I have a question about the last one, it's where it says viable site options. Does that just mean sites within the Fort River property? Because it said, because up above it says that we're looking at the Fort River Elementary School site. Does anybody know what that?
The answer is yes.
Yes, so it's some, so just seeing where on that site
Yes.
the building would
Yes.
have to be suited.
The
Okay.
intention, I mean, hopefully this isn't a construction problem, that people look at that language, it gets too convoluted. The point, this is why it's good to bring in the pre-K business, is the point of this writing was to try to clarify, because you may recall, there was like a lot of debate in town about this, that we're, whatever the town ends up doing and deciding it needs to do, in terms of what we're trying to accomplish here, we're looking at the suitability of the site, the suitability of the building in terms of reuse or renovation or demolition, range of options. And then, given the site, where could we build an elementary school on the site? And then for the building itself, it's intended to be a pre-K through 6, which isn't intended to be artful, at least on our part, this wasn't intended to be artful. So we currently have a building that can, I don't know what the maximum capacity is these days at Fort River, but I mean, in other words, an ordinary elementary school, you have a better way of putting this, just an ordinary elementary school.
Yeah, we're not looking at any, there was no explicit commitments to look at that school not co-located, not a school that was larger
Right.
than the structure of Fort River now.
But also, like, if there's like whatever the natural range should be of a normal
Yeah.
elementary school in our town, whether it's 300 kids
Oh, I see.
or 800 or 600 kids,
Right.
we weren't trying to prescribe that, but we weren't also saying it should be an academy of 150 kids, nor are we saying it should be like a 1,200,000 school person super school. We weren't saying that either. And there's nothing else to it, it's just yeah. Make sense? I think that makes sense.
I have a question. Does the committee set up an estimated budget saying, giving orders to the designers, we want to try to design within this budget, or is it going to be design and then the budget?
I don't know.
I think the end product, I mean, the whole point of this is to, how much will it cost, given what we want? and that's why you end up with a cost estimate.
So many times you say, when if I'm building my house, I say, this is my budget. I have to have a design with this budget. I don't go to the architect and say, build me something nice, and then I look at the budget. You always have like a range. You don't say,
I think it's clarified in the second
but this
sentence in the first paragraph to be fiscally responsible, right? So I think that if we're looking at what the building is in the community that it should serve and what's reasonable for square footage cost estimates, that we'll be behaving fiscally responsible. I don't think we're predetermining a budget.
I think that's something, this is an important topic, and I think we probably should visit that as a specific decision that we make of, are we going to establish a limit on what we're spending? And is that going to guide the design principles, or which way are we going here? So I think that probably is a discussion that the committee should have.
I agree that process will impact what we wind up with later. Yeah, go ahead.
I certainly agree with that. But I think from my recollection, both when the committee went to town meeting and talked about this, we explicitly at least talked about our desire to see a range of options. It's why also I mentioned explicitly the other idea a moment ago, the question of whether any portion of the building can be reused or renovated, versus demolition and total new construction. Not because I'm biasing the notion either way, but I think at least from our perspective, what's written here is what's written here. So I think it should be a conversation for this committee. But at least coming from outside, from the perspective of what we've been debating and talking about, I think our assumption was that the options that we discuss here would include a range of options, not just in terms of, factors of how that's built and that are design or programmatically related, but also potentially fiscally related. There might be a range of options saying, I hate to say all the money in the world because no one really means that, but essentially, here's an option, and then there may be alternative options in terms of what are considered desirable based on different costs. So I'm just saying, in terms of the way we discussed it, I think we were open to the idea that there might be, that there might very well be multiple options that were presented at the end, and that they're not just also that they're not necessarily biased in terms of saying, because you can imagine doing it like we have the right option and then all the bad options. That wasn't really the point, but looking at what are the factors that are going into the decisions. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Just two things. I think it is going to be, there's going to be some discussion that's going to have to be before, I'm not trying to segue to the procurement part, but in many procurement requests for proposals, requests for qualifications, you put in there something about what's the estimated cost of the project. Not as in, it's a little different than what the solution I heard, but you have to give some level of scope to the people who are going to be looking at the project. So I do think there's going to have to be some early discussions about it. And I think there's going to be a range, because we don't, my opinion is, until, and architects in the room can correct me, but until you really know more about the site, more about the current structure, it's really hard to come up with, you don't know all the variables that are going to contribute to the possible cost of a project. And so I think having that conversation about ballpark and ranges we have to do, because you're going to have to put it into a legal document to hire, or whoever the committee is going to hire, and that's going to change by external variables that we don't have all the information on right now. So if I'm wrong, the architects room can tell me I'm wrong, but that's my understanding is the cost isn't just the brick and mortar and the people around, and some of it's about variables that you find out as you investigate the current building, current site in more depth than we have current information about. So that's my 2 cents.
Thanks. I'd be curious to hear from the folks with architectural background, if you've got input on this.
Well, certainly, I'd say from my perspective, it's a little of both. It is good to know if you have a budget going in, or at least what your budget range is. Can the town afford only something between X and Y? And then you try to design to that. At the same time, you do want to explore those options. And you don't necessarily or you don't necessarily want to bracket those at the beginning, so that you can see what the range is gonna be and what your options are, and then you can use finance and many other things as a tool to choose which one is appropriate for your situation.
Thank you.
Well, and I mean, I think that this is maybe what you were getting at, that we can look at what kind of average cost per square foot are for these types of buildings. I think that's what you're saying. So we can kind of work at it backwards. That basically, that we want a school that can serve this many students in these grades, and they figure out the square footage, and we've given them a range of what the cost per square foot would be, and work it that way.
Because,
Go ahead, and then,
so I think that, you know, it's many things. It's determining the program, knowing approximately how much square footage we need to have, some geotechnical investigation, because that certainly impacts a lot of the building construction, sometimes adversely. And I think that we can do some precedent study based on other regional schools that have been recently built, and at what cost and at what square footage. Because granted, the more you build, there's some economy of scale. So we might not have a direct apples to apples comparison with another school that was recently built down the road. But we can certainly extrapolate an appropriate range, as Mr. Sullivan and Ms. Page have suggested.
When I say that, I mean, I feel like this is why this is called a feasibility study. I mean, we will discover, hopefully through this process, that if for some reason that this site necessitates a budget in order to get a viable school building here, I mean, that's kind of what this process is about. And how much a school building will cost on the site is going to be part of the determination of this process.
It probably is worth saying that part of the possible outcomes of a feasibility study is that you determine that the site or the building isn't feasible. I'm not saying that's the case here, that's what we're going to study, but that does happen. Sometimes it's a negative response.
Thank you. Thanks for all that input. In the interest of time and sticking to the agenda, unless there's any like urgent calls for other input, I'd like to move us forward. Cool. So the next document that we were looking at, I think, was the various articles from the town. Mike, can you say more about these? Or?
Sure. So I thought it was just important to have the town meeting warrant article from this town meeting that funded this study. So if you look at Article 15B, it just, I guess I should read out loud, shouldn't I? To see if the town will appropriate, borrow, or transfer from available funds a sum of money to conduct a feasibility study for Fort River Elementary School, and to meet this appropriation, the treasurer, with the approval of the select board, is authorized to borrow said amount under and pursuant to Mass General Law, Chapter 44, Section 7 of the, or pursuant to any other enabling authority, and to issue bonds or notes to the town therefore, and further, any premium received by the town on the sale of any bonds or notes approved by this vote, less any such premium applied to the cost of issuance. Such bonds or notes may be applied to the cost approved by the sale with the reduction of borrowing authority, therefore, by a like amount in accordance with Mass General Law, Chapter 44, Section 20. I've really got the short end of the, whatever. That was less fun to read than the articulate school committee statement.
Thank you for skipping me.
Yeah.
So would you like to make a second?
That's fine.
But just, I don't know, certainly up to the chair's discretion whether they need to discuss it. It was more just that I wanted to, I'm not going to chair, just to reinforce that it came from town meeting and, see another with their hand.
Yeah, go ahead.
And I think the actual motion as it was made, this came from the warrant, but I think the motion as it was made and voted was the idea of feasibility and what else we were going to study was fleshed out.
Yeah.
And I can find that language and forward it to you. Because there is a little more directive in the actual language that was proposed on town meeting floor than what's here.
All right, thank you. Yeah, that would be wonderful. Right, that's good.
Thanks, Claire.
Okay, great. And then the last part of this agenda bullet was the feasibility process and the schematic design process. We have the colorful flowchart type object. I did not write this, and I'm looking at it for the very first time. Others who know more about this kind of process, would you like to step in and do any explaining, or do we want to do a reading step-by-step kind of thing?
I can
I'm not
just
sure
say
what
where it came from, you know, and this isn't a process that this committee is under any directive to follow. It just was trying to help explain to the stakeholder groups, different stakeholder groups last spring about what might be in a feasibility process. And the left side is essentially what was presented as a potential path that could come from the town meeting vote that occurred. The right side, just to be explicit, is not anything that this committee has been tasked to do. It's just the left side of the page.
Okay.
Again, just to be super clear, it's not a directive, it's more just talking to other people who have been through these processes, MSBA or non-MSBA, which this is. This was like a menu of a possible process that could be followed. So I just thought, since it was presented in town meeting at the same time as this article was discussed, just I wanted to bring it to everyone's attention.
Thank you. Should I summarize this in some way for the recording, or I'm not sure what?
Or hold it.
To give some kind of a summary, this is sort of the timeline of all the pieces that need to fall into place, both what this committee is doing in terms of hiring various project managers, designers, consultants, and all the way down the line with architects, and then also evaluating costs. And this is 16 to 20 months. And then the other half of the page that Mike was referring to is the schematic design process, where the architect and team in collaboration with other people form designs, and then we talk about the design cost versus initial cost estimates, but that's not our gig. We do all the planning stuff before that.
And is it correct to assume there'd be a whole other town meeting vote in between those two columns as well, because it's a separate funding process?
I mean, my sense.
It's super correct.
Yes.
All right, so I'm drawing myself another arrow, our teacher nerd over here. I'm going to draw myself another arrow saying like town meeting vote takes place between these two things. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I make a suggestion?
Sure.
Because I know that, Mike, you offered that there's a PowerPoint presentation that will be sent to Amherst Media to be included. Would it be possible to send this as a slide? I think it might be helpful.
Great idea. Happy to do it.
Thank you.
I think it was another handout.
Yeah, go ahead.
Mike, I was wondering, since you included the Article 15, shouldn't you include also the article about the environmental study and the appropriation of money for the environmental study and the roof? Or that doesn't fall in with us?
The roof does not.
The environmental study does. So should that be added?
So,
I don't remember which number it was.
yeah, so my recollection is that when we talked about this article, and you can certainly correct me if I'm remembering, or anyone, because there's a number of town meeting members here as well, it was expected that the environmental study would be covered by this article if it passed. And so there was another article about environmental studies that was passed, but it was almost like, it wasn't contingent, but it had to be talked about because no one knew if this was going to pass or not. So when we came up with the dollar amount of $250,000, we assumed that could fit within this feasibility process.
So that the other money is not separated. So I thought that town meeting had appropriated the money independent of this documentation.
Yeah, that may be true, but I'm sorry.
As someone who wasn't here when that town meeting happened, what were the provisions of the environmental study?
I mean, I think that's an issue because that was not only for Fort River, but it was also for Wildwood. And it was a separate article. And I think we need to get some clarification. I'm not sure if you remember, Claire, how that.
I thought it was a much smaller number, and
It was $25,000.
It was a health study at Wildwood School, which is completely separate and not part of our charge.
Well, that's the question, is it a part of it? I mean, has it been folded into the charge of the school building committee?
So my sense was that when this was presented, environmental consultants, all that was included in the $250,000 as a sum total. I know exactly what you're saying, and I'm not sure how to resolve. I get the conflict, But I know when I presented this, both at Joint Capital Planning as well as when it was presented at town meeting, the environmental consultants weren't seeing it as a separate thing. It was intentionally included on the flow chart as being part of the $250,000.
Do we not see that as part of our charge number 3 in the last paragraph of the mission? Starting hiring an architect with strong experience with school projects and is committed to green zero energy buildings, hiring other consultants to work in concert with the architect, including landscape designers, structural engineers, school safety experts, civil engineers, green design, energy consultants, environmental consultants, and geotechnical engineers. Does that not fall under that?
I guess what I'm hearing is a potential difference in the scope of what they're looking at.
Gotcha.
If they're looking at Fort River School, that makes sense that it's part of this. If it's also including something at Wildwood, that seems like something different, or not, I don't know, I don't
I
have
think that
any
there's
memory
an
of
issue
that.
that $25,000 that was approved was meant to deal with 2 schools, but
Right.
it's also, I think, a slightly different scope. So I think the environmental consultants that are, listed here as kind of a general thing about a building project did not necessarily cover the environmental health assessment that was intended for those schools. So I think we need to really clarify, who's taking charge of it. I thought that was going to be the facilities director that was going to organize that.
Do you have-
Yeah, I do. I just, no, I agree. I'd love to get better clarity on this, and I'm not sure we're gonna get clarity sitting here right now. I think it's clarity we're gonna have to bring back to the room. Because I'm undoubtedly wrong, because I know we were talking about a million things last spring. But I thought the discussion of the budget had to do with like looking at the roof. And that because we had different articles about assessing the viability of the roof, we were thinking about toggling between what do we do if this didn't pass, then we need to make sure we add money to look at the roof because it just would have to.
Right.
If this does pass, then all of a sudden we may not need the money for the roof, we can put it in over here. I could be wrong about this. I thought the environmental thing was actually separate and was just being done, but logically the deliverables out of it would inform the work of this group. But I could be totally wrong, I could be misremembering everything.
Right.
Yeah.
Good, you guys are okay. I think there were separate articles. I completely agree with what Maria said. And maybe a discussion to have, we're currently very close to hiring a new facilities director, is whether that's a better task for the facilities director to take on, or whether, because there's all this work that's happening by a team here, what would be preferable? So, I think there's money that was passed, I completely agree. And I think maybe the building committee should have a discussion, not necessarily tonight, but at a future meeting about, I'll just say from the school administration side, as someone who's supervising facilities director, I'd be really interested in and be very open to ideas of the building committee. Does it make sense to have 2 concurrent processes going on around environmental studies, environmental health? Maybe the answer is yes, maybe it's not. Or does it make sense to think, well, a lot of this work is happening, does it make sense for the same people to be doing a more holistic study that's going to inform this project? And so, my sense is, I think we should get more clarity around kind of the warrant articles and around the town, but I think that in and of itself is a good topic for a future agenda, in my opinion.
Thank you. Yeah, I will write that down and make sure that comes back to us in a future meeting. Just because I'm not quite familiar always with everybody's roles, do we have ways to get clarity about this and then bring it back to the committee?
Yes.
Yes, awesome, great, thank you. Cool. I'm trying to figure out, can we make the things happen between now and then? Thank you. Great. Here's the agenda. Okay. Any other last bits on this flow chart or the articles before we move on? Okay, I'm going to move us right along. Communication and public outreach. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I think procurement procedures was actually the next.
Oh, okay, right. Procurement procedures.
If you would.
Okay.
I don't know how. Yeah. So what we have here is a very high-level overview of the general procurement procedures for the building.
What's going to present it is what, everyone has the handout, so.
Okay.
Don't necessarily evaluate if you don't want it. So I'll grab my own now. Yeah.
So first slide is the laws of the state that govern procurement policies. The design service aspect is governed by Chapter 7C. The construction procurement is governed by Chapter 149, which incorporates Chapter 3039M. And then those are the big ones. Chapter 30 governs construction contract law, and Chapter 70B governs the Mass School Building Authority. In discussions coming into this, it was unclear at the time about whether this committee would be pursuing Mass School Building Authority funding or not. And this is kind of done with an eye to complying with Mass School Building Authority regulations, but there are things that they want that if we don't get funding from them, we do not necessarily have to do. So keeping that in mind. Very high level, your steps basically start with hiring an owner's project manager, or OPM, then going into designer selection work, the actual design work, and then construction. The owner's project manager is required on all public building construction valued at $1.5 million or more, is an experienced registered architect or professional engineer who serves as the town's agent during planning, design, and implementation. Usually hired as a third party, although the law does allow us to name a town employee to do that work if they meet all qualifications still. The OPM is independent of whoever the designer, general contractor, and subcontractors are, and is selected in a qualifications-based selection process, not a price-based competition. The OPM is required for the construction, but it is permitted to do the feasibility study before selecting an OPM, and the designer can then continue on to subsequent phases of the project. The Mass School Building Authority would require the OPM to be done first before the feasibility study. The designer selection process is a very rigidly defined process under Mass General Law consisting of these 7 steps. The first is to adopt written procedures, and those procedures are already in place in the town. The second step is to develop the request for qualifications, or RFQ, which gives a detailed scope of services, including deliverables and timetable, states the criteria that we'll use to evaluate the bidders, is based on a standard application form that the Commonwealth provides, and sets the fee for the designer, which can be a fixed fee or can be a not-to-exceed limit that is later negotiated with the apparent winner. Steps 3 through 7 are relatively straightforward. It needs to be advertised at least 2 weeks, probably a little more for a project of this size, in a newspaper and in the Central Register, which is published by the Secretary of State. The committee evaluates all proposals equally and selects from them 3 finalists based on the qualifications and ratings that we set out in the RFQ. From those 3 finalists, they are ranked, and that ranking is based on checking references, optional interviews, which the committee will likely decide to have interview these people. Those 3 are ranked, and the 6th step is to finalize, which is very straightforward if the fee is set. If it needs to be negotiated, that's another step with the apparent winner, and then contract award for the designer. For the design work, I would refer you to the flow chart that we saw in just a moment ago as to how the actual feasibility and schematic process works. I was anticipating having to talk about that, but we've pretty much laid that out. After schematic design and the town approves final funding, we proceed to the construction process, where a general contractor is selected along with any subcontractors, which is done via invitation for bid, which is a lowest price process. Certain trades will be sub-bid, and there will be DCAM certification required for those subcontractors. And that is a very high level, very fast overview of the process. So if there are any questions, I had included a very rough timeline, but you also have that from the previous previous flow chart. So the timeline is very flexible theoretically. If there's no debate, we could have an RFQ in one meeting, advertise for 2 weeks, rank finalists in another meeting. It'd be done in less than a month for selecting an OPM, and then a similar process for a designer. If there's debate, it can take longer. But theoretically, it could move very fast. And I'll take any questions if anyone has them. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mel. I feel like in future meetings, I'm going to have a lot of questions
Oh,
more about
certainly.
process details and what that is. This is all new to
And
me.
this was very high level. This was not at all nitty gritty and the law can be very specific on certain things too.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, a bit of a question. So it's wonderful to have a procurement officer for the town of Amherst, so I'm glad to have you here. Are you gonna put together the procurement documents?
I think it would make sense for me to have at least a coordinating role on that, to put them in order and make sure that, and be our contact between town council and on those. So I think it would make sense for me to coordinate that. I won't be the deciding voice on what those are, what the actual qualifications are, and I'll leave it to the committee, but I think that would make sense.
Thank you. Yeah, Mike, go ahead.
In your experience in similar projects, once a project manager is brought on, do they assist in the procurement, or would you see your role as continuing in the procurement of other?
A large amount of that would fall on the OPM. It's kind of their role is to coordinate the general contractor and the subcontractors, and they often are, I know on the previous school building project, the OPM maintained the files and basically ran point. That would be fairly typical for an OPM to do that.
I have a question regarding the OPM and to the MSBA funding. So if the OPM is not hired first, it automatically disqualifies for MSBA funding, even if it's done at some point during the feasibility study? At which point is the trigger point with the MSBA?
That is a very interesting question, and it's not clear. The MSBA process normally starts with the MSBA. You need to go into an eligibility period, you fill out a lot of forms. Even the selection of the committee is usually not the first thing that's done under the MSBA process. In advance of this meeting, some people expressed hope to me that we could start with the feasibility study and then present the feasibility study to the MSBA and slide into their process if we followed those prerequisites. There is no guarantee of them accepting that. If we do not start this process with the MSBA, we should not assume that we can finish it with them.
Does that mean then that at some point we're going to have to, possibly for later meeting, discuss whether we want to start with the OPM so that we can possibly have that option?
I think you probably want to start with the OPM, even if we decide not to even pursue MSBA funding. The state generally recommends an OPM be selected first on any project. It would be my recommendation that we start with the OPM. I just wanted to make it clear that we're not obligated to.
Okay.
But that's up to the committee.
Okay. Cool, thank you.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if it does make sense to reach out to the MSBA, or has that been done to kind of just give them a heads up that we're doing this and start that discussion with them now, and don't preclude us from, as best we can. I mean, obviously they are holding the keys to the kingdom here on their funds, but is that something we would designate as a role of one of our committee members to try to be a liaison with MSBA?
We certainly could. I mean, have we done any of that kind of? I'm looking at you, Mike, because I think.
Sure, no, that's fine. So they start accepting new statements of interest in the spring. So there's no process that's ongoing right now. I'm not to preclude any communication, but in terms of, like,
We will be submitting.
so that's up to the select board and school committee. I don't want to, I'm not suggesting that I have any extra information, but it's not a decision that this committee or myself makes. That's a elected official's decision. So I don't know how to answer more.
And the funny thing about this is, as you're describing it,
Yeah.
obviously this process sits sort of asynchronously with submitting a statement of interest and then being accepted or not accepted into MSBA. And as I think probably everyone around the table recalls, there was a lot of felt interest and sort of momentum around the idea that we wanted to understand the site conditions and things like that. And so we wanted to proceed with this process, even though I think unless you have the opinion that modest modifications to the site or building can be made to make it more viable, which is a position a person could have, then logically, at least from a purely financial standpoint, it would be profoundly advantageous to be in the MSBA process just because they cover a substantial portion of the cost of constructing the building. And so, and I think from a lot of the people I heard from this in the town side, was there was support for doing the feasibility study because, let's say for the sake of argument, you just purely for the sake of argument, you got an MSBA, you decided to build even just a single neighborhood elementary school, but you did it on a different site, or you did it on a part of the site of Fort River, you might end up still being left with a substantial portion of the remaining site that could be utilized for something else, or even the building that could be utilized for something else. And so having some kind of information to understand what the possible uses of the building could be or its deficiencies was useful for the town too, which is something I kept hearing last spring. The reason I'm saying all this is I'm not trying to clear my throat or filibuster. I'm just saying all this because if somebody said, does this really make sense? Wouldn't you want to be in MSBA or wouldn't you want to, we got the tension point between those things. The committee hasn't talked about a decision either on submitting to MSBA this spring, but just between you, me, and the camera and the people of the town of Amherst, I can't imagine we're not going to, because it wouldn't frankly make any sense not to. Whether you submit it on Fort River or you submit it on Wildwood, or both, why on earth wouldn't we submit? Since it's helpful advantageously. And also one thing we heard repeatedly was that, just from different folks, was that there isn't really any clarity that there's broad commitment in the town to pay for a new school outside of MSBA, right? And so if there's no clear commitment to fund the entire cost of a project outside of MSBA, this is again speaking for myself, but I think there are other people on the committee who feel similarly, that it just doesn't make any sense not to submit. So whether somebody should be designated to talk to MSBA now and at least have a conversation about what we're doing, would that make sense?
The submission is not the feasibility study. That's an entirely separate process. So the work of the feasibility study doesn't have to be complete to do that.
Not even remotely. As a matter of fact, they would anticipate, sorry, you're the expert on this part, but I mean, they wouldn't even anticipate you've done any feasibility study going into the MSBA process. So the application is much more elegant. And in fact, the two can operate independently from that perspective.
Yeah, so my quick advice is, I think, developing it, whether it happens again now or our next meeting, developing a list of questions that the group wanted to generate for and commentary for the MSBA and putting it in writing so that we're not relying on one person who calls and then reports back would be my recommendation to the group is what do we want to share with them, what questions do we have, perhaps someone was tasked with writing that email and then when the response comes in, everyone can see it because I think it's, I get the call piece, but I think the call then, I wrote notes and gets interpreted. My experience is much better to put it in writing and then the group can then view it.
More thoughts or input on that?
I'd like to propose a motion for the election of the secretary for the committee.
Seconded. How does that work?
I think somebody else has to say that.
Okay.
Second.
Thank you. I don't know how to run it from here. How do I run this?
Just ask for nominations.
Nominations for secretary of the committee. You can nominate yourself or somebody else.
I think you need to define the role.
Oh, right. Can somebody with more experience in committee roles please describe what we would be looking for in a secretary? Go ahead.
I think the person who made the motion should be able to start that.
Great, thanks.
So I think we should elect from one of our group, someone who can act as a point person for collecting this type of information, for dissemination to the group, and for writing the draft email to be sent to the MSBA, and handling communications with other town committees, SOPs on.
Thank you. Questions or clarifications about that role?
Well, I'm wondering if it rolls better into our agenda piece as far as communication and public outreach. Like I feel like there might be, maybe the secretary would be more limited role than necessarily public outreach. Like I feel like that's a bigger job than just the secretary could do. So I don't know if we want to bring the secretary back into that discussion.
It sounds,
Or define it more limitedly than someone who's going to be the front person in the town.
can I suggest an idea that perhaps we have a secretary who does all those things, and then the secretary works closely with someone who's a community and town, like, publicity person. Like, that could be two people, especially since both those roles could be, you know, fairly large for one person to take. Yeah, go ahead.
I think this is similar to Heather's suggestion, but I think it would be helpful to talk about communication, to handle the communication and public outreach agenda items before nominating or electing. So we kind of see if there's other things that come up out of that. And then with the committee planning, it seems like we could take up the vote then. Does that make sense?
Sounds good to me. I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads around. Any opposition to that? No? Sweet, okay. So then, let's move on to communication and public outreach, and I'm going to make a little note that we're going to have secretary and communications point person vote after that.
I actually have to go, so I just want to apologize that I sort of double booked, so I'm sorry. No.
That's your question.
Please.
How do we get, is the school the appropriate place where we'd have like a Fort River feasibility committee link or something on a website or something like that?
So if someone wanted to build a website, it could be there, it could be, I've seen it different places for other building committees. Sometimes people want to build like a Google site, or what's the other one that people do that's like a free website software? Was it?
There's one called Wix.
Yep, and there's WordPress. I've seen people use those kind of things. So I think wherever it's built, we can link to. So it could be our software. I'll be very candid with you. Our software is a little clunky and not necessarily natural for users. Yeah, just because it is, right? I'm not discouraging it, but it, I guess my suggestion would be if there's someone who's doing that, they might have an easier time building it elsewhere and having it linked to from our website than living on our website.
That's sort of, pardon me for following up, but that's sort of what I was getting at, is that if you told me, oh, we have in-house someone who does this, and they'd be happy to work with the committee to help, then I'd be like, that's really important information right before you get up and walk out the door.
Yes.
If you're saying that's not really the case, then, okay.
Yeah, I think we struggle with capacity to, would struggle with capacity to add additional things. We're really trying to revamp our website as it is, let alone add pages.
Thanks.
Is there anything else before?
Well, the communication and public outreach item on the agenda, I'm not sure where to go with that, having not written the agenda. Is this sort of like just continue the conversation that we have here? Were there other things that needed to be brought up around it?
Well, other than the fact that, as we wrote in the mission, we're really excited to have really robust outreach and public engagement, and that could flow a lot of places. Like, there are a lot of things you can imagine in your head we should be doing. It's not prescribed. It's left to this committee to figure out what we want to do and how we do it. That's why I was picking on Mike on the website thing, because if we had a natural resource to do that, I didn't want us to have to reinvent the wheel. I wanted us to be able to say, great, let's rely on that person and work with them to give them content or to shape it. So the answer is it is sadly as wide open as it is. I'll give you a great example of this. Mike and I hadn't worked through getting Amherst Media here in advance and hadn't thought through that. It's obviously the right thing to do and a good thing to do. We just hadn't worked it through. But luckily, another member of the committee stepped forward and said, hey, should we be doing this? And then took the bull by the horns and got everything set up, and now we have a wonderful volunteer who's doing it. And so the main point is that's literally an example where, is this something we would have thought of? Yeah, eventually, we just hadn't, and it's cool it's happening. And there's probably a million other things this group could think of that we should be doing, and it's up to us to figure it out and then commission it or identify the person and figure out how to do it.
Yeah. The only thing I'll add on my way out is I think the conversation that was emerging as this topic was segued was, at least for me, I don't want to speak for Eric, exactly the type of conversation we were envisioning of who's going to do what in terms of communication, what's a strategy, and it was wide open, but I think this is very consistent with what we're looking for maybe. Thanks everybody, sorry for the delay.
Great. So then we can continue on with this communication and public outreach topic. I would like to ask for, I'm not sure of like the official way to ask this, I would like to ask for like a 5-minute like stretch and bathroom break. Yes?
Yeah, do we want to just finish up our agenda item of procurement procedures and discussion? Is there
Oh,
anything
yes.
else as far as like, I think it sounded like we wanted to have a discussion with MSBA. I think that was, and now we just need to we'll table how we do that back under outreach. But was there anything else as far as procurement that we needed to touch on?
I didn't think so.
Great.
But thank you for checking in on closure there. Great. Is everyone else okay with us taking a 5-minute break?
Yeah.
Okay, great, cool. And what time are we officially slated to end, students? 6. Okay, great. I'll see you all in 5 minutes.
I always feel like that's one of those things that if it needs to happen, everyone should absolutely say yes.
Okay, great. I'll see you in 5 minutes.
Cookie? No, I'm okay.
Okay. What made it that
So you're on the committee too, or you're just working there?
Just working.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Doug.
You're welcome. Because I've seen the like solicitation for volunteers go out like, I don't know how many
Numerous
times. And yeah, do you know if anybody else has stepped up
One
yet?
other person did training with me.
Oh, good.
You said in the end.
But
that
hopefully
you
you're
can
gonna
train
too, but
that
One other person that's not on the committee.
kind
Do
of
you
wish
know
that you
if-
said something about wanting to see on site.
I think they could probably use more.
Yeah, like if more people on the committee got
Could
trained up,
amend
do you think we'd be capable of running it and participating?
I trained so that I would be the emergency backup person, but I think we have a lot of work to do on the committee, so I am hoping that I never have to go over and do that, think about it, but if I need to, I do.
It's so it is a little more than set it and forget it.
the idea.
I mean, yeah, it's an hour and a half, 2 hour training to
Yes.
And that
to
fourth
get work
question
on
was
these
from
now.
the email.
Yeah.
So we
Which
could
leads me to believe
use
that-
more
and
people
no,
just to,
Which
we don't,
leads me to
want
think
to
they
be able to
probably
talk about what we're gonna do.
because
I don't
who's
know if
gonna-
Tony,
who's
or
gonna-
the
who's
person is
gonna
going to be able to
mail
do all this.
an
If we
RFP
have more,
thing,
we would obviously,
right?
it wouldn't be such an imposition on.
I mean, my thought was, if there's a company in India that can meet all
But
our reference requirements.
having said
which
that,
is
Joe will
substantial,
get
and
people
those are
trained
pretty
up
substantial past work,
quickly, and
then maybe we're okay.
that's easy to do.
But we're within our rights to amend if you want to push it amend.
I guess they were about 25 minutes here. Go ahead. Demonstrate history. It seems discriminatory
Yeah.
to require an annual meeting.
Right.
Is that?
Knowing that somebody.
Yes, that's what we're doing.
Oh, this is the way.
Yeah, I'll explain that.
Yeah, I can.
But the likelihood that together, we check all the references.
Yeah, everybody's happy?
Yeah, I think we're actually pretty good. I just want to make sure.
No, right now I'm on a term position. I've never like run a meeting in a Robert Rules of Order
Yes.
sort of way, and
I mean, the question is,
I've actually run other committee meetings for, in my other life, I organize music festivals. And I run those committees. This variety of and so I'm not quite used to this kind of system, so thank you all for your patience.
It's not actually facilitating, I think, the natural.
The soft service kind of talks about it.
In terms of like facilitating, there's nothing that will work on Yeah, I think the most important thing is getting from the group, not just about how you promote one another, but also in trying to help ferret through the rules.
Right.
I say, I've been doing Robert's Rules since 18 or 19 years old. Part of it is
Follow it.
and I'm not being partisan.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean,
That there is like a hardcore organized that used to attack and disrupt all meetings. And so if you were going to chair and run a meeting, Robert's Rules of Order was and then you had to run two things. One had to like navigate people who were using those rules to sort out and like just mess up meetings. And then you had to figure out on top of that how to like facilitate meetings in ways that still felt and I don't wish that experience. Over the years, I started working for the regional school committee because things were as tumultuous as they were.
Yeah.
First,
I mean,
I have an hour. Let's try to get to it. This doesn't
No, I was gonna say this seems like,
I tried to put you in.
it seems like we're all in it, like. Hey, everybody, in 1 minute, we will reconvene. 1 minute warning.
Yeah, it's funny actually. It's funny on the NAPO, the purchasing officer.
Make your last point,
So what is the chair of
I teach the whole school.
How long have you been there?
This is my fourth.
So did you just follow it?
Yes.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
And is, I mean, obviously you're really is just such a wonderful person.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I inherited all kinds of experience.
That's awesome. That's really neat.
We're really different students and really different, I think we have very different teaching styles, but.
That's could make you a wonderful person. That's neat.
There you go.
All right.
I tried to get the.
Hi, everybody, welcome back. Thanks. All right, welcome everybody. So let's continue on this discussion of communication and public outreach. Some things that we wanted to talk about sort of under this umbrella were what we want to do in terms of how to do outreach with the community, if we want to have a community liaison, a plan for communication, and this is sort of related to the question of a secretary and whether or not we want that to be one role, two separate roles, how we want to do that, and then at the end of this, we will vote on a secretary. And do we also need to vote on who might be a communication liaison, or is that something that doesn't require a vote?
If those things happen by consensus, I don't think they have to be voted on in that regard. It's probably good for the secretaries because it's like a sort of.
Right,
But
yeah,
if you have volunteers to work on that communications thing.
okay, thank you.
Just a question, in the agenda, there's a couple of items that are specifically listed as vote, and I know that happens at the school committee as well. So just in terms of procedurally, if there's going to be a vote on something, does that have to be previously noted or no?
You don't have to. It's a nice thing to do. I don't mean to sound funny, but I mean, one of the things I've seen we talked about this actually around the regional committee items, and our attorney had advised us, you don't have to keep writing in there that you're going to vote on something or putting in a draft motion. But they said, like he said, you can. Mark Terry is that attorney. Said, but you can do it. And I think in his committee, because he actually works on a school committee, he was a member of a school committee, he said they stopped doing it because they felt like they were inhibited from doing votes when they otherwise might wish to. And since I put together the regional agendas, for me, I felt like I wasn't giving enough information to the public, so I biased it on the side of saying, hey, we might be voting on something tonight. So if people looked at it publicly, they could know that it wasn't just a discussion, it might be a vote. I also, by the way, because the first one said vote, we knew that there'd be a vote. Because actually this follows that. Because I don't think we thought we were going to vote for, I don't think Mike and I thought through the notion of whether we'd be voting for a secretary under communication or outreach or anywhere. We weren't really thinking about that. So we probably would have written it in if we were thinking. Make sense?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if
I don't think by law you have to, but I think it's nice to do.
Okay.
So before you dive into the next conversation, unfortunately, I couldn't get the childcare coverage past 5:30, so I have to leave soon. And I know, I'm sure it'll come up in the committee planning piece, talking about the permanent time or a permanent range of times that we'll meet. And I just wanted to throw out the notion that I don't mind this time on a Thursday, but if it started at 3:30, it's much easier for me personally, so. I will depart.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm curious, just for a point of order, like, are we bound to any Robert's rules or anything like that? Like the formation, the way we structure our committee, are we bound to a certain structure? Do we know?
It's not written anywhere.
Okay, great, cool.
Awesome.
Just kidding. Votes then.
Okay, cool, thank you. Great, so communication and outreach. I'm not entirely sure how to start this conversation. Go ahead.
Throw something out. So I mean, in the formation of this committee already, like there were certain roles, I mean, even in my introduction, like coming into this meeting, I feel like because I'm representing CPAC, it's incumbent upon me to be a liaison at a minimum between that group and this group. And so I fully intend to do that by going to CPAC meetings. And there were other, like Mr. Salvo, who just left, I mean, he's the parent PGO representative to this group. And, the school committee, I mean, you guys were tasked with forming this group, so I don't think in any of the discussions I heard that, I guess, like, did the school committee also envision sort of as representatives from these groups that we'd also be liaisons with these groups?
Two things. One, we really tried to leave it to the judgment of this group to decide how it wants to operate. So if there are deviations from that kind of a norm, then the committee can decide to collectively to do that. Clearly, yes. I mean, if there are folks on here and there were CPAC, there was obviously an assumption that you'd be collaborating with people from CPAC. Same thing with the PGO. I think the expectation was a teacher or a staff member would talk to other teachers and staff members and do whatever outreach felt relevant. But there was also an assumption that the group would identify, I think we might even put it in there, but identify some point or process for communications, and that there had to be some sort of process by which that work was going to get done, whether it was, however it's done. whether it's an individual or a subcommittee or whatever it is, that there needed to be some sort of organized process for outreach beyond groups that are individually identified, so more broad communication, outreach meetings, whatever.
So I could see identifying like things, I mean, at a minimum, I think we would like to have a webpage where we would post links to Amherst Media things, maybe post meeting notes. Then we have to decide who is taking those meeting notes on a consistent basis. What other kind of things, and then you've got to push that information, like, I don't know. So I could see one person being like the webmaster, for example. That could be a formalized role. And then, like I said, for those of us who have specific groups who are reaching out to, but I mean, the people who are like the community at large, that's you two guys, right? No. Who was, you're a parent?
I'm parent.
Parent at large, your community at large, and your community at large. Did you guys give much thought before this meeting about what that might look like? I mean, I know it was.
I think that was to do with the formation of the committee, but not the roles on the committee.
Right, because the idea is to have like a broad sampling of who's giving input into these discussions, but that doesn't necessarily say what kind of output is happening. So then I guess the question becomes, I know that there are some of us, like you, and I volunteer myself also to talk with the staff at Fort River, who see our role in publicity as part of our representation here. But I don't want to like make that assumption for anybody else if they feel like that's beyond their capacity or time commitments or whatever. It might be useful for us to, I think it might be useful for us to have someone who's sort of the person who's got tabs on all of the kinds of communications that we're doing, and then we can collaborate with that person, and I can say, okay, communications person, here's a thing that I'm doing with the teachers at Fort River, I'm hosting this meeting, or just so that person's on the same page as to what communications are getting done and are not, and
So they could have there's a big hole over here, and would be able to help us fill it.
yeah, go ahead.
I think there are two different issues here. One's direct communications and getting input, and the other one is the general broad communication of what is going on with this committee. I think that has to be one person having one message of the community. And gathering the input, yes, because many times somebody is going to need some information from the school committee or the CPAC or something that we're going to need. So you might need liaisons, but not necessarily that person is going to be making the communications. I think maybe the communication should be same person having one message out.
I agree with the need for consistency and that the message is clear and transparent and unified. I think that it would also behoove us to pull some lessons learned from any previous committees and their public outreach efforts. And I see this line item as, a larger, not how we do it technically, but why it needs to be done, how often it should be done, what different venues and medias we should be engaging the community with. I think we've raised the website, but as far as feasibility studies and engaging the end users and getting their input, I think that is a broader question than just a point person on communication.
I think the first issue is setting up a website and an email so that it's an email from the school building committee has an email that emails can go in and emails can go out from that email, and it's accessible to the secretary or to several people in the committee so that they can have access to that email to receive comments and things, and a website to send information out.
So the order of operations thing, we're talking about how often we're communicating out. I wonder if we should think about how often we're meeting before we think about how often we're communicating out.
Yeah.
Can I make a suggestion? I mean, this is a big topic. I think
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a topic we need to get right, and
Yeah.
I don't think we're really prepared to do that. I don't know if we'd like to form a subcommittee to kind of come up with ideas, and we can funnel
information to whoever volunteers to do that and to bring that back as an agenda item for the next meeting. And then just kind of be more prepared to do some action. But I'm watching the clock and
Yeah, I was worried
worried
about
that we
that
don't
too.
even, like you said, we don't know when we're going to meet. And there's a lot of, I think we have to do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, that sounds great. That sounds good to me. So if I like the idea of forming a subcommittee. Do we have folks who'd like to be on said subcommittee? I can join it, certainly.
I would envision this as being like a brainstorming thing and bringing it back. I don't think it has any particular power. I think it's just
Right.
somebody sit down and do this outside of this meeting time.
I'm also curious if anyone has certain skill sets, like is anyone really fantastically adept at creating websites, making websites? Like, or is there somebody within our group that this is the wheelhouse for? Or just
I'm
brings
not,
them, no.
I'm not expert. I can make a WordPress, but I'm not expert. Like I've been modifying one of PGO.
Mhm.
Well, also someone who has experience with communication. Is there anyone
Yeah,
here?
communications, no.
Yeah, that's not my.
That's not my agency.
I mean, it sounds like we're all kind of tentative about claiming this, but since this is just a brainstorming subcommittee of what sort of communications we want to have, I'd like to invite anybody to join me in like coming up with ideas in this, even if it's not a, this subcommittee is going to decide exactly who will write such and such email to such and such whatever, but this would be the group to envision. Okay, we want to make sure to reach people in multiple languages in lots of parts of town, by these various modes. Brainstorm with me? Who wants to come brainstorm with me? Great. Awesome, thank you. Okay, great.
And that's, you don't want to hit quorum.
Right, yeah. Cool, great. So the three of us, maybe we'll schedule something and figure that out. Thank you. And then we will bring this topic back to a future meeting. So we have this question of voting on a secretary. That secretary might be the person who would help coordinate something like a doodle poll if we want to schedule another meeting. Is that part of the role of the secretary?
I have a question about, that was brought up by the kind of description of the secretary. Is this committee staffed by someone from the school district? Or are we also staffing it, the volunteers? Because some of the things that you brought up seem more like staff
Right.
things.
I haven't served on a committee within
Yeah.
this state, but the last committee that I served on was staffed, and they handled a lot of the work for us. So they published the agendas, they made sure that everything was noticed properly in the newspaper, and I don't know how that's handled here for this committee.
I mean, I would assume it is from the first one, but yeah, do you have any insight?
I don't, which is actually why I was asking the question earlier about the website business, because I thought there might be an in-house resource. I mean, I do know that for this meeting, everything didn't just magically happen. I mean, Deb Westmoreland did the doodle poll. I was checking in, but God bless America, someone else, probably Deb herself again, was actually producing all these materials and getting them coordinated. And my assumption had been that we were going to continue to get that support, even if kind of like what I do on the agendas collaborating with Mike, there's like heavy input. So like in other words, my point being is that if the secretary or the chair, like if you don't do anything and you don't communicate, then nothing's going to happen.
Right.
But that there is someone there to help execute. So we need to double check on that, because I hope would be the case.
Yeah, I mean,
Was anyone here on the previous building committee? Thank you.
So once they hired the OPM did a lot of the heavy lifting
Mm-hmm.
in creating the agenda, publishing the agenda, scheduling future meetings. Mike was certainly still heavily involved. Sasha provided some staff support as well. So I think we need to check back with Mike that we can assume a similar level of support for this committee. The budget is certainly different and the scope is different. So I don't think just that flat assumption makes any sense. But,
I should add to that when we were talking about the OPM, similarly, we had discussed the school committee, I mean, and with Mike, had discussed that the OPM will pick up sometimes some of the functions around helping to even maintain or upload things on a website or prepare some materials, but that based on past experience, it was important to have members of the committee who are directly engaged with the community and also like accountable essentially for the work we're collectively doing, also still be directly engaged in that communications work. So both on staff support, but then also on communications, there should be some sort of back-end support from the OPM.
Thank you.
So it sounds like we need to ask Mike what
Yeah.
we can, what food support we can expect.
Right, and then when he responds, if he responds saying that we do have district support for things like meeting coordination and stuff like that, then great, we can use that. But if he says you're on your own, I'm happy to, at least for now, send out a doodle poll of some kind and coordinate us until we figure that out differently.
Well, it sounds like until potentially we get the OPM on board, then we try to offload
Yeah.
those tasks on that firm.
Yes, cool, thank you.
So I serve on another committee on which I'm not a voting member, but I am staff support. And so there's a model where we could elect a secretary and that person takes minutes every meeting and gets them to the webmaster who publishes them because we have an obligation to make our minutes public. Another committee does a rotating minutes duty, so that's another option. And I'm curious to know if, as Mike informed you of your appointments, did you also get copies of the open meeting law and of the conflict of interest law? Because as appointed committee members spending municipal dollars, we all have that obligation to understand the law and follow it. So I'll be sure that that happens, I guess.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So certainly we're going to table this like broader communication topic for another meeting. In the meantime, can we vote or can we take nominations for a secretary? I would like to take nominations for a secretary.
Well, the Secretary of Note, yeah, sorry.
Or, sorry. I'm a little bit confused as to where we go from here.
Yeah, well, we have two different secretaries on the table. One's a minute taker, and then, we've been deciding how we're going to do that, and the other one is the one that Christine suggested, which I think we need more information about what staff support we're going to get before we decide on that, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because I'm just thinking about, I think you're thinking about the action items that have been taken down here, is Mike going to take care of all those, so that's the question, yeah.
And I wonder if we don't move into committee planning, and is that an overview of how we think this committee will function? If we need subcommittees, what other roles might need to be defined aside from secretary, and then set for regular meetings?
So I think the question is maybe to change the secretary to the minutes taker, and the other, we can come up with a different title for the role that you were envisioning, and decide whether we want to share that responsibility or have someone be that position. So.
In school, we used to call them a recording secretary and a correspondence secretary.
Okay. Great.
I'm sure we can have other terms.
That's actually great. It's perfect.
Great. So then, let's do that. I personally think that having some consistency in note-taking would be good. Thoughts? You looked like you were going to say something.
No, I just, I hope that that's something that we can get some staff support on as well, because I worry about Diane typing and not being able to participate. So.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So it sounds like we have more questions.
Set it for an agenda item for our next meeting to
Yeah.
make those kind of decisions and just kind of
Great.
roll for now.
Yeah, I'm happy to, for this meeting, since we have questions about how all this stuff is going to get implemented, I'm happy to look at these minutes, pull action items, and then poke Mike because I think a lot of it is just questions about procedural stuff.
Process.
And I'm happy to do that. Diane?
I can clarify a couple of things. So the only agenda items that we are following up on right now is falling to you on many of them. One of them is more clarity around the article around, is there another $25,000 outstanding for a different environmental study out there? You said you would follow up on that one. And I got another one for you down here.
Open meeting law and conflict.
Thank you, open meeting law and conflict of interest. And then the next follow-up is to schedule the brainstorming session between Heather and Culinary.
But then there's
And then the
also
question for
follow-up-
Mike, I was going to take on the role of
The staff
talking.
role.
I was going to follow up and talking to Mike, that's an
Okay.
really easy one for me.
Okay.
I can do that.
Thank you, awesome. Thanks. And then there's what were you saying, the staff role?
That's, I think that's what.
Oh, I see, oh, yes,
That's
okay.
it.
Yeah.
All right.
Any other tasks that I missed? Those are-
There was actually, you were also going to find the original, the motion
Yes.
that was
Yeah.
passed by
There's
town
more, you
meeting
said there was different.
that
language.
additionally specified sort of the town meeting charge to this.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
That's all I did.
Yeah.
It had been brought up, but probably not concluded, about talking to MSBA. I'm assuming we're not talking to MSBA yet. That was, so it was brought up, but I don't think we decided what we're doing.
Right, yeah, that's something.
It's sort of an agenda item for next.
Yeah.
That goes along with correspondence secretary, reporting secretary, right?
Yes.
Order operations, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, in the interest of time, since we don't have a lot of it, I wonder if we should go to the payment of the Amherst Media invoice, and then we can use whatever 3 minutes we have left to do some more discussion and close up, and then we'll wrap up at 6, right on time. So let's grab that invoice from Amherst Media. Go ahead.
I can speak to this. I have spoken with the folks at Amherst Media, obviously, and we made arrangements to have all of these meetings videotaped, but because of contractual obligations, this falls outside what they would normally do for, school committee or select board. So it has to be volunteers. So the way this is going to work is that anybody who's doing the videotaping has to be an Amherst Media member. And that's what this is about. So this, this is conversations between Eric and Mike and myself, and we said, it doesn't seem fair that the poor volunteers that are coming here to do this would, for their troubles, also pay the fees for that. Amherst Media was kind enough to have the membership be all that they would need to do, not have any additional fees for training and so on. So this is $35 per person that is trained, who then can take the equipment out, bring it here, do the videotaping. It will go back to Amherst Media. They will do their post-production stuff, and they will post it for us. They will broadcast it. It'll be on presumably channel, I don't know whether the education government channel, but they'll broadcast it. And all we have to do is get kind volunteers to do this. I am the emergency backup volunteer. I hope to never do it. But there are 2 others. If anybody knows anyone else, please contact me or Deborah Swarland, and we can make those arrangements and get more people trained. So 3 people have been trained, $35 a piece, $105. This is our very first expenditure, which we haven't signed our forms yet, so I hope that's okay for doing this. So that's what that's about.
So it just has been moved, seconded, and obviously we'll debate it, but then approved by this committee.
All right.
Motion to approve the Amherst Media invoice.
Second.
Now we vote, great. Discussion on this. All in favor of approving this payment for this invoice?
Aye.
All opposed? Excellent, thanks everybody.
And thanks to the volunteers.
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely.
All right, great. So we have 15 minutes before we leave. We have committee planning, which of course will, spill over into other meetings. I guess I'm sort of open to directions for where this 15 minutes can go.
We should
conversation.
probably set our, I mean, that's not
Logistics.
funny about it.
Yeah.
Figure out when we're meeting next, is there a regular time we're meeting, what time we're meeting,
Okay.
so that we at least know that if we hit our 15 minutes, we can meet again.
Right. Thank you.
I have a question regarding that. Shall we, I know that people will take me and I'm gonna have myself for saying this. Since we want to get traction going, put an effort and try to make at the beginning these meetings quite often, I don't know, every week, every other 2 weeks, considering there's a break, so that we get, there are many things on the agenda we need to discuss.
Yeah.
So if we get some traction at the beginning, then we can start spacing them out. But my suggestion would be if we can make an effort and make the next meeting next week or the week after soonish, so that we can get some traction going. Because there are many things, I don't want to leave things hanging and then, oh, we'll meet in 3 weeks and then waiting.
Right. Yeah. I like that idea too, personally.
A nice stuff for everybody.
Is this doodle poll material, or are we going to try to hash it out here?
Well, I think the question is, I think something to decide here whether it should be a regular time or not a regular time.
Right.
And I would vote for regular time.
Yeah. So this day and time frame worked for everybody. We did have a request for slightly earlier. Is everybody here generally able to make it on Thursdays, somewhere in the 3:30 to 6 p.m. range?
I will be available until next semester starts. When next semester starts, I will not be available.
Okay.
That's mid-January. Late January, I will be.
I'm going to have that same problem
Similar.
this time.
Okay, all right. So this could be the sort of thing where if we want to meet more frequently at the very beginning, we could have meetings at this time, and then at a later meeting, we can figure out when a new time would work better with your next semester schedule. So we'll keep this for now. Yeah.
Makes sense.
Would meeting next week, same time, work? Yeah.
Just as a point of personal privilege, so next Thursday, I'll be preparing for a screening of a showing that the district is putting on at the middle school here, Backpack Full of Cash.
Right.
It's a film, a documentary that is narrated by Matt Damon, so I'll be here with MTA President Barbara Mataloni. So next Thursday is going to be really tight.
Also, is there a certain amount of time prior to a meeting that we have to post that we're meeting?
48 hours.
Just 48 hours? Okay.
Which is really 8 hours longer than that, because the town clerk has to do it for us.
Okay.
So just,
Yeah. Yeah.
they remind me when I get it wrong.
Okay.
And I think realistically, getting one more meeting in before the holidays is sort of a realistic goal, or are we thinking we want to try
I would
to do? You'd like to get 2 in because of your, okay.
Okay. So 2 weeks from today could be a definite possibility.
Not for me, but on the next
Can I ask one question first? Are we
Yes.
talking 3:30 to 5:30, or are we talking 4 to 6?
Actually, I could.
I personally would be fine with 3:35 to 8. Any major conflicts if we shifted half an hour earlier?
Only referring back to the,
Yeah. No?
So 2 weeks, that's,
Okay.
I might have conflicts on the 14th. I mean, I just work, because I work till 5, so I have to leave early when I come to meetings.
Okay. Would you be comfortable coming in late or?
Yeah, that'd be fine with me.
Awesome, thank you. Great, so then let's do 3:30 to 5:30, 2 weeks from today, for sure. And then I don't actually have the physical calendar in front of me, but.
The following week would be the 21st.
The following week is the 21st. That's like right before the holiday break.
Indeed it is.
Yeah, there's no way.
That's better than a week.
I'm gonna grab my notes, check out my calendar.
And then it's the
Is there any other day that next week will work for more people?
A weekday.
I know it's,
Afternoon.
well, the other question was, we talked about the schedule changing. Like, would it be realistic to do on the first week of January? It's still pretty close.
I think it's more realistic. we also want to make sure that we have the space available.
Yeah. Okay, great, so let's look at the first week of January. We are not here on Monday the 1st, we return to school on Tuesday the 2nd, would Thursday the 4th work? So far, no conflicts with Thursday the 4th.
I'll be out of town, but if someone is willing to set up Skype, I could.
Oh, awesome, yeah,
If we have the space, we can definitely do that.
great, wonderful, we'll Skype you in, thanks. Okay, good, so let's say 2 weeks from today, and Thursday, January 4th, 3:30 to 5:30.
That's the 14th.
The 14th, so it's
Thank
12,
you.
14, and 1, 4.
Yes. Yep.
In the meantime, hopefully, even the communications folks will have met, so we can be making progress there, and maybe even a subcommittee.
Yeah.
Another subcommittee might be able to do some work before that, so hopefully we can keep rolling.
Right.
Would people be open to having, like, we have one place where we can put repository on information, like a Google folder that everybody can dump information and everybody has access?
Yeah,
Um,
I would like that.
I think so that it's private, it's not open to everybody, it's only information to circulate within, and then
Or
it's,
is conflict with open meeting law and that kind of stuff, like?
and that I don't know.
Open meeting law will say that you can share information, but you cannot discuss it. So
Right.
it's a very fine line to walk when you're doing that kind of thing, or distributing information by email.
But that's why I'm saying not by email, but there, so it's, as long as there is no opinion and there are facts, how does it go?
So you're saying sharing information, but not having a
That is-
Google Doc set up so that there's conversations going on there? Because
Yes,
then
right.
you wouldn't be able to know if you
So-
had quorum, but.
So yes, I can give you a chart or a spreadsheet,
Yeah.
but no one can comment on it.
Yes.
And you still have to be careful that a chart or a spreadsheet doesn't embed an opinion. So it really does have to be just information sharing. And that's how people get in trouble with open meeting law.
Okay, so links to articles or to things that's opinion.
A link to an article is fine, just don't offer an opinion on whether you agree with the article or not.
Right.
So if everybody could read this before our next meeting, that's fine. But
You should
when you
read
send a
this,
link.
this is great, it's really persuasive. No.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like this kind of a folder might be really useful for, as like reference document, right? Like if we have, like something like this, like the warrant articles, right, and the language in here, useful to have as a reference, not, something that comes up in a meeting perhaps, but it's not something that we like, that I personally would ever be tempted to discuss over email. But have like, just having like a little reference library for ourselves, I think we might find useful, as long as we're all very much on the same page about, that thou shalt not discuss opinions about this stuff, that this is just for reference purposes.
Well, I'd say once we have a website up, I'm personally highly in favor of having any materials that are actually being utilized by the committee to be available on that website somewhere. I've gone to public, even in this town, and I don't mean it as a criticism, but it's certainly elsewhere. I've gone and looked before thinking, oh, there's this cool thing this town's doing. I'm gonna go find some project document, and my God, you can't find it anywhere. And you look everywhere and you can't find it. And it's so incredibly frustrating. And I'm talking about places I don't live, where I just, as a matter of professional curiosity, wanted to find out. For residents in the town, I personally am biased in favor of saying I don't want there to be any real information that we're utilizing that anyone in the public can also click on and read themselves if they want to.
Okay. That sounds like a great idea to have it.
Our website is organized enough that it's useful for us and the public.
Right.
That would be pretty.
So that sounds like something to discuss, a little bit when we figure out who's going to be doing that kind of communications pieces. Are we okay with holding off on that? We'll have our handouts that you all can take home, but yeah, cool. So I'll table that for that discussion. We have 5 minutes left. We have 2 future meetings in line. Yes, go ahead.
I have a question for procurement. So some of the most important things that we have to get going right now are the OPM. So what is that going to take from this committee? I mean, I know that you're going to be able to do the nitty-gritty of it, but what do we need to do to make that happen?
So the OPM process, unlike the designer selection process, isn't prescribed in law, but they recommend using something very similar to the designer selection process for selecting an OPM. The first step would really be to develop our RFQ for that. And it's kind of up to the committee how you want to proceed. We have an RFQ from the last go-around that we could adapt just the facts and keep the general form. I would be happy to start working on a draft along those lines. If maybe it makes sense for us to distribute that RFQ to the committee first and review before we start work on a new one. I have those documents, I can make those available.
I'd like to request, could you send us that information? And if there is something that we could be reading, so that we can be making informed decisions about how to write the RFQ, how to do this. If you can get that to us before the next meeting, maybe we could have, just be able to make that work.
It would probably make sense to distribute the previous RFQ. I can do that tomorrow to the committee. And come in with ideas, maybe to task me with them coming up with a draft for the next meeting. That's kind of the process I was envisioning.
Can you send the old RFQ, and if you come up with a draft before next meeting, send us to us in advance so we can also look it before coming to the meeting so that we can also...
If you would like me to already start working on a draft before the next meeting, I can do that. I
think that'd be
am
great.
a little hesitant of putting that work in before you've even seen an RFQ yet.
Agreed.
But I can do it if the committee wants.
Thoughts?
I think it would be wise to distribute the former RFQ and let everybody read it and become familiar with it. And then at the next meeting, we can certainly discuss it and gain input and comments, and then task Mr. Delaney with the revision of the draft.
That sounds good to me.
Did you have something?
Well, my point was that if we go that process, we won't have any RFQ until probably January, and I guess we're gonna have to be discussing it again before it goes out, so then it will be out probably by mid-January, late January. So in the process of, okay, we should not rush, but wherever we can shorten times, it would be good, wherever we can. That was my point of trying to meet sooner, more often, and try to get things running, because we want an OPM as soon as we can. Because it's going to be very helpful. I understand that. I understand we need to read it, but at the same time we can read the original, read the changed one, and.
I agree. I think it's important to get an OPM on board as soon as we possibly can, but I think we also want a decent advertising period so that we attract the proper number of candidates. They have to, I'm sure we'll be going through a review and vetting process. So I think that the timeline for onboarding an OPM is long, as you've noted, but I think we need to do our due diligence and make sure that we're attracting from the best candidate pool and giving enough time for them as well.
Yeah.
Here's my, and again, I'll do what the committee wants, but my concern with giving you guys an RFQ at the next meeting, with no direction as to what I write, I'm basically gonna write what you had last time.
Right.
And maybe that's great, maybe we don't like that idea. I'd like some more feedback from you on a general form before I put that work in.
I think in particular the scope of services that has to come out of this mission and this charge is important to do in public session. And if we ask Anthony to take a stab at that first draft, we haven't provided the due diligence that we're responsible for.
And my assumption under any circumstance is that there's going to be a good portion of the RFQ solicitation that's going to be, I hate to call it boilerplate, but there are going to be lots of things in it that you're going to simply recommend in terms of how a firm describes their qualifications and experience and background, that you're probably going to be able to, without any argument from the group, essentially cut and paste and move forward with some other document. But I think that given, to be blunt, given the fact that a recent school building project in this town foundered for many reasons, but one of them was a popular consideration that more work should have been done in framing the study and framing the work and getting buy-in and broad consensus around the deliverables and tasks and things like that. It may stink to spend a couple of weeks doing this, but the last thing I want to do, and I frankly could hardly stand putting up with, is the idea that we would rush a deliverable that somebody in hindsight would say, well, now we're looking at firms based on a scope that we don't agree with and didn't have consensus, and we didn't take the time to develop the consensus. If we can move fast, that's great, but we should really make sure we get that right.
I'd like to follow up on that point and say that a well-crafted RFQ will allow us to really compare apples to apples when we receive the responses from the candidates, and then we'll be able to, better discern their abilities to provide the services that we've requested and understand how they'll be providing them. So,
Thank you. Sorry, go ahead.
Just one, if you could, along with what you said about some things being boilerplate, when you send that out to us, could you somehow note the areas that we need to give input on that you can't touch, this other stuff you can't touch, that's gonna have to be, that's legal.
This part is statutory, this part.
Right, and this is what we need to work on as a group.
I can absolutely.
For those of us who are not familiar.
Thank you. I think that's a great jumping off point for us for next meeting. How does the adjournment process work?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Great.
And then we.
All in favor of adjourning?
Aye.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.